I'm going to look at some of the potential threats to contamination of water sources, particularly pesticide contamination in Grenada, where I currently reside, and then talk a little bit about the wider English-speaking Caribbean islands. Just quickly, unless you're 40 plus, you may have a trouble identifying the dot in the ocean that is Grenada. Look at the bottom right-hand screen. We are up there, so not too far from us, but if you're flying over Grenada and the pilot says, look, don't blink, because if you do, you'll miss the island. Grenada is actually 3 islands, very small. Just to give you a context, the main island is about 21 miles long, 11 miles wide. Some of you have lakes that size. So you look at some of the problems that we're talking about in Latin America, our islands, and Grenada is representative of many of the other islands, very small geographical areas. A bit about the geology of Grenada and many of the islands. They're basically volcanic, and Grenada in particular, very steep slopes. Basically, Grenada is one big mountain, and wherever you go within a couple hundred feet, you're going to hit some slope. 70% of the mountain slopes have a gradient greater than 20%. We had a presentation yesterday from the representative from Jose from Panama, showing what can happen in the context of rain when you have slopes that steep. Land-based sources of pollution ultimately will affect marine environments because you're no further than maybe 5 or 6 miles from the marine areas. And so whatever happens on land quickly reaches the coastal areas. The Caribbean area in general has had agriculture as being one of its mainstays of its economy. And that still persists to this day. Agricultural activities are quite common, and many chemicals are used and generated, and many waste products are generated that can affect watersheds. So looking at the watersheds in Grenada, there are about 71 distinct watersheds, of which 21 are used for water supply. The topographical map on the right there shows you again that you have this very steep top ridge that quickly goes to the coastline, and so you have very fast runoffs because of that. In terms of what the land is used for, if you look at the darker greens there, you see quite a lot of areas are used for agricultural purposes, and superimpose upon that are the watersheds. So whatever happens in terms of agricultural practices will impact upon the watersheds, especially the ones that are being used for potable water. So what are the threats to freshwater ecosystems? When you have agriculture, especially in tropical environments where pests and weeds are a big concern of farmers, you're going to have pollution from agricultural chemicals. The practices that are used, especially if you're in a mountainous area where you have a lot of clearing of the vegetation and then trying to plant on very steep slopes, even slight rainfalls can generate quite a lot of runoff, not only of soils, but also the pesticides that were used and the crops that were planted in that area. So you have heavy sediment loads of streams that result from erosion caused by the removal of vegetation. There's a lot of farming close to the banks, on steep slopes and close to streams. And typically farmers will use the rivers and the streams to wash their gears, wash their pesticide applicators, because it's just convenient to do that. The crops that are grown, again, as I said, in tropical environments farmers rely a lot on pesticides just to make it through. Unlike even here in temperate climates, you have the threat of pesticides, but magnify that by 10 times in tropical areas, farmers almost rely entirely on chemical means for controlling insects. Many of them, however, lack proper knowledge of how to use these pesticides. And so you'll have them doing cocktails where you will have 4 or 5 chemicals being mixed. in concentrations that far exceed what is recommended, 10 times, 100 times. You are starting to see now also some sort of pest resistance. And as a result of that, you have even greater use of pesticides being used and greater experimentation to figure out, well, if it didn't work this time, what can I do this time? And so all of these practices are exacerbating a problem that has been going on for quite some time. So typically, this is what is used. We don't have the big mechanized means of applying pesticides. You have someone with a backpack or a pesticide applicator. They're used in unregulated and unmonitored ways. There is a complete reliance on chemical means to control pesticides, and there is typically a lack of knowledge. There is some awareness that this could be dangerous, but still there's a lack of the necessary knowledge, and there are occupational issues as to protection or lack of protection when applying these chemicals. So you come to the Caribbean, and you see all these exotic fruits and vegetables. What is not seen is what you're getting besides the pumpkin or the banana or the mango. And in the context of this, we're going to look at now water contamination of pesticides in the, because of the use of these pesticides. This is just a subset. I would have to do 2 more slides of some of the approved insecticides that are used in Grenada. And so whatever you have, we use, plus some. The ones that you stop using, we continue to use because, well, you know, you're getting rid of it, and we're eager to buy it. Herbicides, you have them, we use them. And again, these are not exhaustive or complete lists, but give you an idea of some of the different chemicals that are used. So the big question, and the focus of this particular presentation, are the water sources, the surface water sources in particular, where in Grenada about 90% of our water is gotten or taken from surface as opposed to ground. Are they being contaminated by pesticides? What's the answer? Well, I'm not sure. Here's an example of a typical river in Grenada. It looks pretty, very pretty. It looks pristine, but can I guarantee that? And the answer is, well, I don't know. It's most likely that there is some level of contamination taking place. The question is by what chemicals, how much, in what areas. That data, unfortunately, is not readily available. In trying to prepare this particular presentation, one of the challenges that we face in the Caribbean is that if data exists, it's very hard to get your hands on it. There is a report that was done back in 2012 that I was happy to hear was done by the FAO by a consultant in Grenada. I asked to receive it, and I was told I couldn't get it because Cabinet had not approved for its release. So in 2012, we're in now 2015, and Cabinet is still yet to decide whether to release that document. So that's sort of the challenges we face in the Caribbean. And by the way, that's not just exclusive to Grenada. In a couple of the other islands, you find that story being told over and over again. So if I can't get the data, then where can I look to see to answer this question? Well, we can probably look at some surrogate measures. What about human exposures? Can we see humans being exposed to pesticides within the Caribbean? Now, I'm not suggesting that we run a study where we take babies or humans and expose them to pesticides. But what we can do is to look to see, are we finding evidence of pesticide exposures in humans? And in particular, the study that I did was looking at prenatal exposures to see, is there evidence that pesticides are making it all the way to when we're at most vulnerable in the development stage? And I'll show you that data in a bit. So the study I'm going to briefly cover is a study that was done back starting in 2008, 4-year study. We looked at 10 Caribbean islands, and we looked at, besides pesticides, other persistent organic pollutants. We looked at heavy metals, in particular mercury and lead. and we also looked at some zoonotic infections or evidence of zoonotic infections. So methodology. One of the interesting things about this study, again, just to put things in context, when you're in a poor country, unlike my colleague and I, Marco from, was saying how the lab that we saw at the Orange County, $25 million lab, he wanted to cry. I said, don't cry. We don't have those resources. Anyway, for this particular study that we did, we had the resources of a mobile laboratory, which we could literally, and we did this, physically take from one island to another to do some of the analysis. And this was from my Canadian colleague, co-author, PI, Eric Duai. And this lab provided us the opportunity to do some of the analyses in country as opposed to shipping them to either, in our case, Canada or other places of North America. So in each of these 10 countries, we had a sampling strategy of taking 50 samples from pregnant women. We took blood and urine samples, and we looked for the things I mentioned earlier on, the POPs and pesticides in urine. This is how the sampling was done, different places that it was sent, and here are the results. I always like to put a human face to this. I'm from the Caribbean. That is my first son. No, I did not buy him at a store, but he does come and he does grow up in a Caribbean environment. So it's always good to, when we have the numbers, to see, well, there are faces behind those numbers. So I'm interested, what's in him besides good genes? So these are the different islands, and we took samples in different places. And again, I want to not try to throw too many numbers at you. We compared, if you look at the bottom two, you see Canada and the United States. And we wanted to see how do we compare to our typical North American partner, neighbors. And in the case of POPs, you'll find that it's not zero. All right, so this one, for example, DDE is a main metabolite of DDT, showing that even many years after DDT has been outlawed or banned or restricted, you're still seeing evidence of it. And in some cases, in some islands or some countries like Belize, Belize is historically considered part of the Caribbean area, DDT is still being used for vector control purposes, and you see that quite evident looking in that chart there. You see DDE, the blue line there, being very high for Belize. Looking specifically at the island where I am at, located right now in Grenada, Grenada is in blue, about on the same level what you see in North America, showing that even though we're the Caribbean, these chemicals were coming down and being used, and we're still seeing the effects of them in the Caribbean islands. Pyrethroids is another class of pesticides. Again, in tropical areas, you have a lot of, for want of a better term, bugs that you don't like to be around, and so we use a lot of pyrethroids. And in general, our use or exposures to pyrethroids are higher than that of the United States and Canada, and in some cases can be pretty high. Like in some islands, this one is Antigua. Again, comparing, specifically looking at Grenada with Canada and the United States. Grenada is the blue, and almost in all cases, these are different metabolites, urinary metabolites. You'll see that the exposures to pyrethroid pesticides are higher in the Caribbean women compared to North American women. By looking at which metabolites appear, you can identify which class or which class of pyrethroid is being used. And so this allowed us to, for example, identify which islands are using which pyrethroids and therefore what exposures are taking place. Organophosphates were used, or it came in after the POPs. The organochlorides were outlawed because of their high persistence in the environment. And so organophosphates are now being used as an alternative. And we see exposures again throughout the Caribbean that are on par with that of North America. Grenada, again, where I am based, you see that, again, it's not zero. And just looking at the data specifically at Grenada, we're seeing exposures to organophosphates that are similar to that of Canada and the United States. All the data, again, can be seen in various papers that have been published, and I'll show you them in a bit. But just to summarize, to give you the summary of what we found for the organochlorines, the POPs, which are by and large now regulated or outlawed, we found that they're generally low. The organophosphates, which we use to bring in to replace the organochlorines, we're finding they're consistent, detected in over 60% of our samples. And in some islands, we had levels that were equal or higher to that seen in the United States. Carbamates is another group of pesticides that we're seeing quite often in frequencies that are above 30%. Other classes of chemicals like phenoxy acids, chlorophenols, and pyrethroids, again, we're seeing levels that are higher or equal to that of North America. And in the case of pyrethroids, they're definitely higher compared to North America. So again, if you're interested in getting more than just a summary, but the detailed results, these have all been recently published, the POPs results, the pyrethroid results, and just recently, within the last month, pesticide results were just published. I'd be happy to share that with you. So quickly to what does that mean? So I'd asked the question early on, are Grenadian surface waters being contaminated by pesticides? I think the answer is most likely yes. It is true, I will concede, that you can get exposures from other sources like food. In the case of mercury, in the Caribbean, it's most likely consumption of fish. But pesticides very likely are getting into our waterways, and there's an urgent need now to establish, well, at what levels, what quantities, and how much of what we're seeing here in the human exposures is coming directly from water exposures. The title of this presentation was Grenada and the Wider Caribbean, so at least I owe one slide to, well, what's happening in other countries. And unfortunately, there's not much that I can tell you other than that it's hard to find data, hard to find published data in peer-reviewed journal. I suspect there is data, but it's hidden in some cabinet, in some ministry. I can show you pictures of how ministries look like if you're interested. I have a few, because sometimes people don't believe, well, why is it not easy to find and extract data? If you come to the Caribbean, I can show you what challenges that can be. But here's what I did find. For example, in Jamaica, it was found that while 87% of the annually imported pesticides in Jamaica are applied within agriculture and household settings, the fate of these locally applied pesticides is unknown. It's a black box. It comes in and you don't exactly know where it's going. But you know, I can show you quite a bit of it is ending up in humans. Another study looking at organophosphate pesticides in vegetables in Trinidad found that 10% of examined vegetable produce exceeded internationally acceptable maximum residue limits. So we're seeing evidence of the misuse or the heavy use of pesticides in the Caribbean countries. So some conclusions. In Grenada, as well as other Caribbean areas, water sources are likely being contaminated by pesticides. There is a clear need for Caribbean governments to, and public health officials to have programs in place that will monitor. We need to monitor, we need to start looking to see what we're doing. Are we managing the use of these pesticides in an appropriate manner so that we can reduce these exposures as far as possible? What's the moral and ethical imperative for doing so? Again, I like to always bring a face to this. And shouldn't a baby's development be the safest place in the world? And we always think of mom as the safest place. And yet, the data I've showed you is that babies are being born bathed in a cocktail of pesticides, and not just pesticides, other chemicals, which if they're coming from the water that we drink, the mother is drinking water that is supposedly clean, is not. What are the implications of that? So if you're trying to sell this argument to a politician who can't see why I need to pay attention to the water in the river that looks clean, and why I need to spend $200 for one test, $200 US to look for whether there's a pesticide, maybe something like this might get their interest, that, you know, you want to get, they want the votes of this young little girl or boy there eventually, and they want an intelligent person. So any questions, concerns, comments, I'll be happy to share those with you. Thank you very much.